The sky over the city was a tired, bruised gray, the kind of color that promises neither sun nor proper snow, just a persistent, cold dampness. A fine, icy sleet was falling, not quite rain and not quite snow, but a miserable combination of both. It was the kind of weather that seeps into your bones and makes you want to be anywhere but outside. On the wide sidewalk, people moved like a single, determined creature, a river of dark coats and hurried footsteps. Each person was an island, hidden under umbrellas or with shoulders hunched deep into collars, their faces set with the singular goal of getting from one warm place to another. The sounds of the city were a muffled symphony of this hurry, the constant hiss of tires on wet asphalt, the distant wail of a siren, the crunch of shoes on gritty pavement, and the low, collective murmur of 1,000 people lost in their own worlds. Moving through this current was a man who seemed to both belong and be separate from it all. He was tall and slim, dressed in a simple, dark jacket that had seen better days and a pair of scuffed boots. He wore no hat, letting the icy speckles settle in his dark hair. His face, often seen on massive screens, was completely unremarkable in this context. It was just another face in the crowd, thoughtful and a little wary. He wasn't walking with the frantic energy of the commuters racing for a train. He moved with a quiet purpose, his hands tucked into his pockets, his gaze taking in the scene around him not as a spectacle, but as a reality he was a part of. His mind wasn't on a movie set or a red carpet. It wasn't on scripts or premieres. It was just on the simple act of walking, of being a small part of this massive, breathing city, of feeling the cold air on his face. He was just a man walking down a street on a cold afternoon. Then, something happened that broke the rhythm of the rushing crowd. It wasn't a loud crash or a shout for help that would make people turn their heads. It was a dull, heavy thud, a sound that was almost swallowed by the general noise of the street. Just a few yards ahead of him, a figure simply crumpled. It was as if the strings holding him up had been cut with scissors. One moment the man was walking, albeit slowly and with a noticeable limp, and the next he was on the ground. He didn't put his hands out to break the fall. He just folded in on himself and landed hard on the wet, dirty concrete. The man was clearly homeless. His body was wrapped in layers of mismatched clothing, a thin, zip-up hoodie over a flannel shirt with a tattered army green jacket on top. His pants were worn through at the knees, and his shoes were held together with what looked like tape. A tangled gray beard obscured most of his face, and a matted heap of hair peeked out from under a dirty woolen cap. As he fell, a few of his meager possessions scattered across the pavement like fallen leaves. A plastic bag containing what looked like a few apples split open, sending the fruit rolling into a dirty puddle near the curb. A worn paperback book landed face open, its pages immediately beginning to soak up the grimy water. A small, dented thermos clattered against the metal trash can with a lonely, hollow sound. For a moment, there was a tiny ripple in the flow of pedestrian traffic. The people closest to the fall slowed their pace, their heads turning for a second. A woman in an expensive wool coat gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. A man talking on his phone stopped mid-sentence, his eyes wide, but the pause lasted only a heartbeat. The river of people quickly began to flow around the new, still obstacle in its path. The woman in the wool coat, after a quick glance of pity, seemed to think better of getting involved and hurried on her way. The man on the phone resumed his conversation, taking a wide step to avoid the fallen figure and his scattered belongings, his face a mask of annoyance at the interruption. A young couple, laughing at something on a phone, didn't even seem to notice, their path naturally curving around the body on the ground as if it were a simple puddle. One by one, they just kept going. They saw the man, but they didn't see him. He had become part of the scenery, an unfortunate but ultimately ignorable feature of the urban landscape, like a broken trash can or a discarded newspaper. Each person who passed by made a silent calculation. It's not my problem. Someone else will help? I'm late? I don't know what to do. I might catch something. And so, the man lay there, completely still, in the middle of a crowd of hundreds. The icy sleet continued to fall, collecting on his unmoving back and soaking into his clothes. The red apples bobbed sadly in the brown puddle. The pages of the book grew heavier with water, the ink beginning to blur. The city rushed on around him, a world of warmth and purpose just a few feet away, but for him the world had shrunk to the size of a cold, wet, and lonely patch of sidewalk. The man in the dark jacket had stopped walking the moment the figure hit the ground. He stood frozen for a second, his eyes fixed on the scene. Like the others, his first instinct was almost to keep moving, to let the current of the crowd carry him past. He was just one person after all. What could he do? But then something held him there. It was the stillness. In a city that never ever stopped moving, this absolute, unmoving stillness was a physical presence. It was a scream in the silence. He watched as a businessman, holding a briefcase over his head like a shield, carefully stepped over the man's outstretched leg without breaking his stride. He saw a mother pull her young daughter closer, whispering something and quickening her pace, a flicker of fear in her eyes. The indifference was like a physical force, a wall of silent apathy. And in that moment, the man in the dark jacket made a decision. It wasn't a grand or heroic thought. It was a simple, quiet choice. He couldn't just walk away. He couldn't be part of the river that flowed past. He took a deep breath of the cold air, and then deliberately he stepped out of the flow of traffic. He moved against the tide of people, walking directly toward the still figure on the ground. It was a small act, but it felt like turning against a powerful current. He was going to see if the man was okay. He moved against the current of people, a single figure walking with a new and definite purpose. The few feet between him and the still form on the ground felt like a long distance, each step a conscious choice to break away from the unspoken rules of the city. The indifferent flow of pedestrians parted around him, some shooting him annoyed looks for his slow, deliberate pace, but he didn't notice. His entire focus was on the crumpled figure ahead. As he reached the spot, he didn't hesitate for a second. He lowered himself to his knees, the rough, wet concrete immediately soaking through the fabric of his jeans. A sharp, biting cold shot up his legs, but he ignored it, settling into a stable position beside the man. Up close, the scene was even more stark. The man's face, what little could be seen through the tangled beard, was ashen and still. His eyes were closed. A small puddle of icy water was already forming around his head, his matted hair soaking it up like a sponge. The air smelled of wet pavement, exhaust fumes, and something else, a faint, sour smell of neglect and illness. "Hey, man," the man in the dark jacket said. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it was clear and steady, cutting through the sounds of the street. He reached out a gloved hand and gently touched the man's shoulder. "Are you okay? Can you hear me?" There was no response. The man on the ground remained perfectly still, his chest not moving in any visible way. The man in the dark jacket leaned in closer, his ear near the man's mouth, trying to feel for breath, to listen for any sign of life. The sleet continued to fall, landing on his own jacket and hair, melting into cold droplets. He was aware of the world rushing by just a few feet away, the swish of coats, the murmur of conversations, but it all felt distant, muffled, as if he was in a bubble. This small, cold space on the sidewalk was the only thing that mattered. His action, so simple and yet so rare in this place, caused a disruption in the flow of human traffic. People began to slow down. The river of indifference was damming up. A man in a suit stopped, his briefcase held loosely at his side. A young woman with headphones pulled one of the earbuds out, her eyes wide with curiosity. At first they just stared, trying to process the scene. Then a flicker of recognition passed through the small gathering crowd. A murmur started, low and uncertain. "Is that? Wait a minute, I think that's... no way." The realization spread like a ripple. Phones, which had been ignored in pockets, suddenly appeared in hands. But they weren't being used to call for help. Small, black screens were held up, their glowing faces capturing the scene. The red recording lights blinked on, one by one. The man in the dark jacket was now the center of a strange, silent audience. He was a movie star, and this was a scene, but it was all wrong. There were no cameras, no directors, no scripts. There was just the cold, hard reality of a man who might be dying at his feet. He felt the eyes on him, the lenses was pointed his way, and a flicker of something annoyance, maybe, or just a deep sadness went through him. But he pushed it down. He couldn't worry about them. He had a job to do. He looked up from the fallen man, his gaze scanning the faces in the small crowd. He saw a mix of emotions, shock, curiosity, and a strange, detached excitement. He needed to find someone who was actually present, not just watching a show. His eyes landed on a young woman, probably a college student, who was just standing there, her phone still in her pocket. She looked concerned, her brow furrowed with worry. He met her eyes directly. "You," he said, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the quiet hum of the onlookers. "Can you call 911 for me?" "Please." The young woman seemed startled to be addressed directly. She fumbled for a moment, then nodded quickly, pulling out her phone. "Yes, of course. What should I tell them?" "Tell them a man has collapsed on the sidewalk," he instructed, his gaze already shifting back to the person on the ground. "Tell them he's unresponsive. We're on the corner of 53rd and 3rd. As the woman spoke into her phone, relaying the information, the man in the dark jacket turned his attention back to the fallen man. He continued to talk to him, his voice a low, steady murmur. "Hang in there, buddy. Help is on the way. You're going to be okay." He didn't know if the man could hear him, but it felt important to say it anyway. It was a way of fighting back against the silence and the cold, a way of affirming the man's humanity when everyone else was just treating him as a spectacle. He reached over and carefully began to gather the man's scattered belongings. He picked up the sopping wet book, its pages swollen and ruined, and placed it gently beside the backpack. He retrieved the 3 red apples from the dirty puddle, wiping them on his own dry jacket sleeve before putting them back into the split plastic bag. He picked up the dented thermos, its surface cold to the touch. These small acts felt more important than anything else he could do. It was a way of saying, "Your things matter. You matter." He created a small, neat pile of the man's possessions beside him, a small island of order in the chaos of the sidewalk. The distant wail of a siren began to grow closer, a welcome sound that sliced through the city's noise. The crowd seemed to hold its collective breath. The man in the dark jacket stayed where he was, a quiet, steadfast guardian. He gently placed a hand on the man's arm, not to shake him, but just to offer a connection, a bit of warmth in the freezing cold. He was no longer a famous actor. He was just a human being, kneeling on the wet ground, waiting for help to arrive for another human being who had been left all alone. The flashing lights of the ambulance soon painted the wet buildings in red and blue streaks. 2 paramedics jumped out with a gurney and their bags of equipment, moving with a practiced urgency. The crowd parted for them, the spell finally broken. "What do we have?" one of them asked, kneeling on the other side of the fallen man. "I just saw him collapse," the man in the dark jacket explained, moving back slightly to give them room. "He's been unresponsive the whole time. I called for help a few minutes ago." The paramedics worked quickly and efficiently, checking vitals, asking questions, and preparing to move the man. They were professionals, and their presence was a huge relief. As they carefully lifted the man onto the gurney, something small and rectangular slipped from the inside pocket of his tattered jacket. It fluttered to the ground, landing face down near the man's discarded backpack. The paramedics were focused on their patient, and no one else seemed to notice. But the man in the dark jacket saw it. He leaned over and picked it up. It was a photograph protected by a thin, cracked plastic sleeve. He turned it over, and what he saw made him stop and stare. It was a picture of the man from the sidewalk, but it was like looking at a completely different person. In the photo, his face was full and clean-shaven, his eyes bright with a genuine, infectious joy. He had his arm wrapped tightly around a smiling woman, and a little girl with pigtails was perched on his shoulders, laughing. It was a captured moment of a life filled with love and happiness, a world away from the lonely, desperate figure he had just seen collapse on the cold concrete. He stood there for a long moment, the photograph in his hand, watching as the paramedics wheeled the man into the back of the ambulance. The unbelievable part of the story wasn't that a famous person had stopped to help. It was what he was going to do next, all because of a small, worn photograph. The flashing lights of the ambulance finally turned the corner, its siren fading into the constant hum of the city, leaving behind a sudden and heavy silence. The small crowd that had gathered began to disperse, the strange little show they had just witnessed now over. The spell was broken. Phones were slipped back into pockets, and the river of people began to flow again, swerving around the spot where a man had almost died just moments before. The man in the dark jacket remained kneeling on the wet concrete, the cold seeping relentlessly through his jeans, a deep, aching chill that was starting to numb his legs. But he didn't feel it. His entire world had shrunk to the small, plastic-covered photograph in his hand. The ambulance was gone, the paramedics were gone, the curious onlookers were gone, and he was left alone with this ghost from a stranger's past. He slowly got to his feet, his joints stiff from the cold and the stillness. He looked at the empty space on the sidewalk, at the dark, wet stain left by the man's body, and then back down at the picture in his hand. He felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if he was holding a piece of a puzzle from a completely different box. He studied the photograph more closely, his thumb gently tracing the cracked plastic sleeve. The background was a park, filled with the vibrant green of summer. Sunlight dappled through the leaves of a large oak tree, casting warm, shifting shadows on the grass. The man in the photo was sitting on a checkered blanket, a broad, easy smile on his clean-shaven face. He looked younger, healthier, his eyes clear and full of a light that seemed to come from deep inside. It was the same face, but it wasn't. The lines of hardship and pain that had been etched onto his features on the sidewalk were completely absent. The woman sitting next to him was leaning into his side, her head resting on his shoulder. She had a kind face, and her smile wasn't just for the camera. It was for him. It was a smile that spoke of comfort, of shared jokes, of a deep and easy affection. And the little girl on his shoulders, she couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old. Her pigtails were flying out as if caught in a gust of happy wind, and she was laughing, a full-throated, joyous laugh that you could almost hear just by looking at the picture. She was holding on to her father's head with both hands, her trust in him absolute. It was a perfect moment, a captured slice of pure, unadulterated happiness. It was the kind of picture that belonged in a frame on a mantelpiece, a daily reminder of love and family. It was not the kind of picture that was supposed to be tucked away in the pocket of a man who had collapsed from hunger and exhaustion on a dirty city street. A wave of questions washed over him. What happened? How do you go from this to this? How does a life so full of warmth and love unravel so completely that it ends with a person alone, cold, and forgotten on a sidewalk? A life isn't supposed to just fall apart like that. There must have been a series of events, a slow, painful erosion of everything he had. A lost job, an illness, a tragedy that had sent him spiraling down until he was left with nothing but the clothes on his back and a single, treasured photograph. He thought about the woman and the little girl. Where were they now? Were they still a family? Or had they been lost along the way, too? Had he pushed them away in his pain, or had life simply torn them apart? The thought was a physical ache in his chest. This wasn't just a story about a homeless man. This was a story about a family that had been broken. The photograph felt warm in his hand, or maybe it was just his own skin, cold from the air. It felt heavy, weighted with the importance of its contents. He couldn't just hand it to the hospital admissions desk and forget about it. That would feel like a betrayal. This man had lost everything, but he had held on to this one last piece of his former life. It was clearly the most important thing he owned. To just let it disappear into a hospital's lost and property bin would be to let the last spark of that happy, sunny day in the park be extinguished forever. He looked around at the city, at the people rushing past, their faces illuminated by the glow of their phones. They were all living their own stories, their own struggles and joys. But for a few minutes, his story had intersected with the story of the man on the ground. And now, holding this photograph, he felt an inescapable pull of responsibility. He had to see this through. It was no longer enough to have called for an ambulance. He had to know what happened next. He had to make sure that this man, this husband and father from the photograph wasn't just another anonymous patient in a busy city hospital. With a sense of purpose that pushed away the cold, he started walking. He didn't go back to his own quiet life. He hailed a cab, gave the driver the name of the hospital the ambulance had been headed toward, and sank into the worn leather seat. The city lights blurred past the window, a stream of red and white. He didn't see them. He just kept looking at the photograph, at the laughing girl on her father's shoulders. The world of cold sleet and gray skies was replaced by a world of sterile white walls and the sharp, clean smell of antiseptic. The hospital was a place of quiet urgency. Doctors and nurses in scrubs moved with a focused purpose through the hallways, their faces a mixture of concentration and compassion. He went to the main reception desk, feeling a little out of place. "Excuse me," he said to the busy receptionist. "A man was brought in a little while ago. A homeless man who collapsed on 53rd Street. I was the one who called for the ambulance. I just wanted to see if he was okay." The receptionist looked up, her expression tired but professional. She asked for his name, which he gave, and then typed something into her computer. After a few moments, she looked back at him. "He's in the emergency room. He's being evaluated. I'm afraid I can't give out any information about his condition." He understood. He wasn't family. He was just a stranger. "I understand," he said. "I'll just wait here, if that's okay." He found a seat in the crowded waiting room, surrounded by other people in various states of worry and pain. He sat for a long time just watching the comings and goings, the quiet drama of life and death playing out in this small, sterile space. He must have sat there for nearly an hour before a nurse in blue scrubs, her face kind and her eyes tired, came walking towards him. "Are you the man who found him?" she asked gently. He nodded, standing up. "Yes, is he going to be all right?" The nurse offered a small, reassuring smile. "He's stable now. He was severely malnourished and exhausted, and he has a pretty bad infection that's been left untreated, but we've got him on antibiotics and fluids. He's a very sick man, but he's strong. He'll be okay with time and care." A wave of relief washed over him, so powerful it almost made him feel weak. That's really good to hear." The nurse hesitated for a moment, her expression softening with a hint of sadness. "The thing is," she said, her voice lowering slightly, "we have no one to call for him. No emergency contact. No family that we can find. When he wakes up, he's going to be all alone in that room." The words hit him with the force of a physical blow. All alone. He looked down at the photograph still clutched in his hand. He wasn't all alone. He had a family somewhere, a family that, for whatever reason, didn't know he was lying in a hospital bed, needing them. And he, a stranger, holding a ghost from a happier past, was the only one who could bridge that gap. The unbelievable part of the story wasn't that a man had been found and saved. The unbelievable part was what he was going to have to do next. The nurse's words hung in the sterile air of the hospital corridor, a heavy, final-sounding statement. He's going to be all alone in that room. The man in the dark jacket felt a strange mix of relief and a profound, aching sadness. The relief was for the stranger on the gurney who was alive and would be cared for. The sadness was for that same man and for the invisible family that didn't know he was here. He looked down at the photograph still clutched in his hand, the worn plastic sleeve feeling warm and alive against his cold skin. The laughing girl on her father's shoulders, the woman with the trusting smile. They weren't just ghosts in a picture. They were real people somewhere out there in the vast, sprawling city living a life that was missing a crucial piece. He couldn't just walk away from that. It felt like a betrayal of the man's trust. A trust that had been given unintentionally when the photograph fell from his pocket. To leave it here, to just let this man wake up in a sterile room with no familiar face to greet him, felt wrong. It felt like abandoning the mission. He thanked the nurse, his voice quiet, and then found a secluded spot near a row of empty chairs, away from the main flow of traffic. He pulled out his phone, his fingers feeling clumsy and large. He didn't scroll through his contacts for a manager or a publicist. He didn't call a friend in the movie business. He found a number listed simply as A. He pressed the screen and held the phone to his ear, his heart beating a little faster than usual. The phone rang twice before a calm, professional voice answered. "Yes?" "I need your help," the man in the dark jacket said, his voice low and steady. "It's not for me. It's for someone else?" He explained everything. The collapse on the sidewalk, the ambulance ride, the hospital, the nurse's words about the man having no one. And then he described the photograph in meticulous detail. The park, the oak tree, the woman's kind face, the little girl's pigtails. "It's an old photo," he said. "At least 10 years, maybe more. The man's name is... I don't even know his name. But the people in this picture, they need to know he's here. They need to know he's alive." There was a short silence on the other end of the line. The person on the other end didn't ask why. They didn't ask for details about the man's fame or the potential for a story. They just listened. "I understand," the voice said. "Send me a picture of the photograph. I'll see what I can be found." "Thank you," the man said, and the call ended. He took a clear, well-lit photo of the photograph with his phone and sent it. Then the waiting began. He didn't go home. He couldn't. He felt tethered to this place, to this quiet mission. He bought a coffee from a machine in the corner, the bitter, watery liquid a small comfort in the long, quiet hours. He found a spot in the waiting room where he could see the entrance to the emergency ward, and he just sat. He watched as people came and went, their faces etched with worry, relief, and grief. He was just another part of the furniture, an anonymous figure in a dark jacket, lost in thought. Every so often he would walk down the hall to the window of the room where they had taken the man. He was careful not to go in, not to disturb. He would just stand there for a moment, looking through the small glass pane in the door. The man was asleep, hooked up to monitors and in 4-drip. He looked small and fragile under the thin white blanket, a stark contrast to the strong, joyful figure in the photograph. It was a painful reminder of what had been lost. Hours passed. The sky outside the large hospital windows transitioned from the dull gray of late afternoon to the deep, dark blue of evening. The city lights blinked on, painting the horizon in a distant, glittering glow. His phone buzzed. It was a message from A. "The photo is good quality. We have a starting point. It will take time." He simply replied, "Thank you." He knew it would take time. Finding people who don't want to be found, or who have simply been lost to time, is like looking for a specific grain of sand on a beach. But he had hope. He had a feeling about this. He spent the night in the waiting room, dozing in an uncomfortable chair, wrapped in his own jacket. Nurses would occasionally check on him, offering him a blanket or a warmer cup of coffee, which he would politely decline. He was fine. He was where he needed to be. The next morning, he was still there when the sun rose, casting long, dusty shadows down the hallway. He felt tired, his clothes wrinkled and his eyes heavy, but his resolve was as strong as ever. He checked on the man in the room again. He was still asleep, but his color seemed a little better, a little less gray. The machines around him beeped with a steady, reassuring rhythm. Around mid-morning, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call. "We have something," the calm voice on the other end said. "The woman's name is Eleanor. The little girl is, or was, named Chloe. We found an old address, a marriage license. It took some digging, but we found a current address for Eleanor. She lives about 2 hours from the city. The girl, Chloe, she would be a teenager now." The man in the dark jacket stood up, walking to a quieter corner of the corridor. Did you talk to her?" "No," the voice said. "I thought it would be best if you decided how to proceed. It's a delicate situation. We don't know the story of why they are apart. A cold call could be traumatic." He was right. He couldn't just have some stranger call this woman out of the blue and tell her that the husband she hadn't seen in a decade was in a hospital. It had to be handled with care, with humanity. "Don't call her," he said. "I have an idea." He spent the next hour making a few more quiet arrangements. He used his resources not to create a spectacle, but to create a bridge. He arranged for a car to be sent to the address they had found, not a flashy limousine, but a comfortable, discreet vehicle. He wrote a short, simple note. It didn't have his name on it. It didn't mention fame or celebrities. It just explained that a man who matched the description of her husband had been found and was in the hospital, and that if she was the woman in the photograph, she might want to come. He included the hospital's name and the room number. He had the driver deliver the note and wait, giving her the choice to come or not, the choice to believe it or not. He didn't want to force anything. He just wanted to open a door that had been closed for a very long time. Then he went back to his vigil. He waited. He didn't know if she would come. He didn't know if the note would even reach the right person. He had done everything he could. The rest was out of his hands. He felt a strange sense of peace in that. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was just trying to do the right thing, to honor the silent plea of a worn-out photograph. He stood by the window at the end of the hall, looking out at the bustling city below. He had pulled strings, spent money, and dedicated his time to a complete stranger, and for what? For the chance that a family might be healed? For the chance that a man wouldn't have to wake up alone. It was the most unbelievable thing he had ever done, not because it was grand or dramatic, but because it was so quiet, so personal, and so completely anonymous. He was just a man, waiting in a hospital hallway, hoping for a miracle. The clock on the wall of the hospital corridor seemed to move slower than any clock he had ever seen. Each tick was a small, deliberate hammer blow against the silence. The man in the dark jacket had been there for so long that the sterile environment had started to feel normal. The squeak of nurses' shoes on the polished floor, the low hum of machines, the quiet, hushed tones of people speaking in whispers, it was all just background noise to the main event happening in his head, the waiting. He had done everything he could think of. The note had been delivered. The car was waiting. The ball was in someone else's court, and this feeling of helplessness was unfamiliar and uncomfortable. He was used to being in control, to making things happen. But here, all he could do was wait and hope. He walked the length of the corridor again, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He passed the room where the man was sleeping, pausing for a moment to look through the small window in the door. The man's chest rose and fell in a steady, slow rhythm. He was safe for now, but he was still alone. The thought nagged at him, a persistent, dull ache. What if he was wrong? What if this was a terrible mistake? What if the woman in the photograph wasn't his wife anymore, or worse, what if she was and she wanted nothing to do with him? He could be causing more pain than he was preventing. He pushed the doubts away. He had to trust his gut. His gut told him that a man who carries a photograph like that, even through the hardest of times, does so for a reason. It's an anchor. It's a reminder of who he is and what he's lost. He had to believe that the woman in the picture would want to know. He found a spot by a large window at the end of the hall that looked out over the city. The sun was beginning to set, painting the clouds in shades of orange and pink. Down below, the city was a blur of motion, millions of people living their lives, completely unaware of the quiet drama unfolding in this small, sterile room. He felt 1,000,000 miles away from all of it. He was just a man, waiting for a miracle. Hours passed. The visiting hours ended, and the corridors grew even quieter. The night shift came on, their faces tired but efficient. He was offered a blanket again, and this time he accepted, wrapping it around his shoulders as he settled back into the hard plastic chair. He must have dozed off because he was startled awake by a flicker of movement in his peripheral vision. He sat up straight, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. A car, a simple, dark sedan, had pulled up to the main entrance below. It was the car he had sent. He watched, holding his breath as the driver got out and opened the rear door. A woman stepped out. She was older than in the photograph, her hair streaked with a few strands of gray, but it was her. The same kind face, the same gentle eyes, though they were now filled with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. She was wringing her hands, her body tense with anxiety. Then a teenage girl got out of the other side. She was tall and slim, with the same face as the little girl in the photograph. But it was now a teenager's face, framed by a cloud of dark hair. She looked scared, her eyes wide as she stared up at the massive, intimidating building. She was holding her mother's arm, a gesture of both comfort and fear. They stood there for a long moment, two small figures in the vastness of the city night, looking up at the hospital as if it were a monster they had to face. The man in the dark jacket felt a surge of emotion so powerful it almost took his breath away. It was them. They had come. He wanted to run down there, to talk to them, to reassure them, but he knew he couldn't. This wasn't his moment. He was just the bridge. They had to walk across it on their own. He watched as they gathered their courage and walked through the automatic doors, disappearing from his view. He waited, his entire body tense. A few minutes later he saw them again, walking hesitantly down the corridor, guided by a nurse. They looked lost and overwhelmed. He knew where they were going. He stood up and moved back into the shadows of a small alcove, making himself invisible. He didn't want them to see him. He didn't want his presence to change anything. He watched as the nurse led them to the door of the room. The woman put a hand on her daughter's shoulder, bracing herself. The nurse said something quietly, then opened the door and stood aside. The woman and the teenager hesitated for a second at the threshold, as if stepping into another world. Then they went inside. The man in the dark jacket couldn't see what was happening, but he could imagine. He could picture the man on the bed, his eyes fluttering open, confused by the sight of the two figures standing there. He could imagine the look of disbelief on his face, the slow dawning of recognition. He stayed in the shadows for a long time, just waiting. He didn't need to see. He knew. After what felt like an eternity, he walked quietly down the hall and peeked through the small window in the door. The scene inside was quiet and still. The man from the street was sitting up in bed, a little stronger now. The woman was sitting on the edge of the bed, holding his hand, her head resting on his shoulder. The teenager was sitting in a chair next to the bed, her hand on her father's arm. No one was talking. They were just together. It was a quiet, fragile, and perfect reunion. He felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. His job was done. He turned and walked away, not looking back. He had one last thing to do. He went to the hospital's billing department, which was quiet and empty at this late hour. He spoke to the tired-looking woman behind the desk. "I'd like to pay the bill for the man in room 412, he said, his voice quiet. "All of it. Whatever he needs for his recovery." The woman looked at him, surprised, but he just smiled gently. He slid a card across the counter. "Please," he said. "Make sure it's anonymous. He doesn't need to know." She nodded, understanding. He signed the receipt with a simple, illegible squiggle. With that, his mission was truly over. He walked out of the hospital and into the cool night air. The city was still alive, a vibrant, pulsing organism of light and sound. He pulled the collar of his jacket up and started walking, disappearing into the flow of people on the sidewalk. He was just another face in the crowd, a man who had, for a brief moment, chosen to step out of the current and do something that mattered. The unbelievable act wasn't a grand public gesture or a scene from a movie. It was a quiet, relentless, and deeply personal mission to restore a forgotten man's most important connection, his family. And for the man who had made it happen, the greatest reward was not recognition or praise, but the simple, silent knowledge that somewhere in that massive city a family was whole again,